Betrayal doesn't just wound the heart. It can transform a soul into something unrecognizable. It was September 15th, 2023, a Friday evening in North Carolina, when silence replaced what should have been laughter. A car was found abandoned at a grocery store. A purse was left untouched on the passenger seat. Hours stretched into days, but the owner never returned. At first, everyone assumed she needed space, a woman escaping the ruins of a 36-year marriage. But the truth wasn't hidden in plain sight. It was buried beneath layers of pride, humiliation, and a plan so calculated it nearly succeeded. Tonight, we're unraveling how nearly 4 decades of marriage ended in a crime so vicious. Investigators would later say the wounds weren't meant just to kill. They were meant to punish. Chapter 1. The Foundation That Cracked. To understand how everything collapsed so completely, you have to go back to where it all began. Richard Thornton was born in 1965 in a small town outside Charlotte, North Carolina. His childhood was built on principles that seemed unshakable: hard work, loyalty, and the belief that marriage was sacred. His father spent 30 years at the same textile mill. His mother raised 4 children without complaint, and together they taught Richard that commitment meant forever, no matter what storms might come. Richard wasn't the type to chase dreams or break traditions. He was steady, reliable, the kind of man who believed in doing things the right way. After high school, he joined his father at the mill, working double shifts to save money for a future he'd already mapped out in his mind. Marriage, children, a house with a white fence, and growing old with the woman he loved. It was simple, traditional, and exactly what he wanted. Sarah Mitchell was different. Born in 1965 in Asheville, she was the daughter of a music teacher who filled their home with laughter and melodies. Where Richard was methodical, Sarah was spontaneous. She had dreams of traveling, of seeing the world beyond North Carolina's borders, of experiencing life in colors Richard couldn't even imagine. But when they met at a church social in 1987, something sparked between them that neither could ignore. Richard was 22, serious beyond his years, standing awkwardly by the refreshment table. Sarah was the one who approached him, her smile bright enough to light up the entire room. For Richard, who had always been reserved and careful, it was like stepping into sunlight. He fell completely, utterly, and from that moment, he never wanted to let her go. By 1988, they were married in a ceremony that felt like a fairy tale. They built their first home in Gastonia, North Carolina, a modest ranch house with enough bedrooms for the family they both wanted. Over the next decade, they raised 3 children. Michael, now 34 and working as an accountant. Jennifer, 31 and a teacher. And David, 28, following his father's footsteps at the mill. For years, the Thornton house was filled with the sounds of a thriving family. Little League games on Saturdays, church every Sunday, summer barbecues where Richard manned the grill, and Sarah organized neighborhood potlucks. To anyone looking from the outside, they had achieved the American dream: stable, loving, unbreakable. But time has a way of revealing cracks even in the strongest foundations. As their children grew up and moved away to build lives of their own, the energy that once filled their home began to fade. Richard remained exactly who he had always been: disciplined, predictable, content with routine. But Sarah, now 58 and watching her reflection change in the mirror each morning, started feeling like a stranger in her own life. The same traditions that once brought her comfort now felt like chains. Chapter 2. The Young Trainer Who Changed Everything. It was January 2023 when a new name entered Sarah Thornton's world, a name that would shatter everything Richard believed was unshakable. Marcus Rivera was 25 years old, born and raised in Miami, where survival meant knowing how to charm your way through any situation. He had moved to North Carolina 6 months earlier, chasing opportunities in the fitness industry and leaving behind a past that included more than just personal training sessions with lonely housewives. Marcus wasn't just another gym trainer trying to make rent. He was magnetic, the kind of man who could make a simple good morning feel personal and intimate. Standing 6 feet tall, with the kind of sculpted physique that spoke of discipline and dedication, he had perfected the art of making women feel seen, valued, and alive again. His smile was calculated, his compliments strategic, and his ability to read emotional vulnerability was almost predatory. Sarah's doctor had been warning her about her blood pressure and stress levels for months. At 58, she felt tired, sluggish, and disconnected from the woman she used to be. Joining Fit Life Gymnasium seemed like the logical step toward reclaiming her health. But when she walked into Marcus's training space for the first time, she stepped into something far more dangerous than a workout routine. The session started innocently enough. Marcus did what he did best, offered encouragement, provided guidance, and celebrated small victories. But he had a way of making every interaction feel electric. When he adjusted her form, his hands lingered just a moment longer than necessary. When he cheered her progress, his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her heart race in ways that had nothing to do with exercise. Sarah, who had spent decades in a marriage where praise had become as rare as conversation, suddenly felt awakened. Those early weeks were filled with text messages that began as fitness motivation but slowly transformed into something deeper. Inspirational quotes became personal compliments. Professional check-ins became intimate conversations about dreams and disappointments. Marcus was playing a game he'd perfected in Miami. He understood that women like Sarah, successful, financially stable, emotionally starved, represented opportunity. Not just for money, but for the lifestyle he craved. The nice house, the financial security, the thrill of conquest. Sarah represented everything he wanted but couldn't afford on a trainer's salary. By spring 2023, the boundaries had completely dissolved. Marcus wasn't just Sarah's trainer anymore. He was her escape, her secret, her addiction. Sarah invited him to the house under the pretense of private sessions, telling Richard it was more convenient than driving across town. Richard, still working long hours at the mill and trusting his wife of 36 years, believed her completely. While Richard was away, maintaining the life they'd built together, Sarah and Marcus were destroying it from the inside. They used every room Richard had painted, every piece of furniture he'd chosen, every space that held memories of their family. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was a systematic erasure of everything Richard held sacred. Richard sensed something was different, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed. Chapter 3. When Forever Became Never. On March 15, 2023, Sarah filed for divorce. The paperwork cited irreconcilable differences, but those two words couldn't capture the devastation they unleashed on Richard Thornton's world. 36 years of marriage, reduced to legal jargon typed on sterile white paper. For Richard, staring at those documents in his kitchen, it felt like watching his entire life crumble in real time. He thought back to their wedding day in 1988, to the vows they'd spoken in front of God and family, to the promise of, "until death do us part." Now, Sarah had rewritten their story with a lawyer's signature, declaring that their forever had an expiration date after all. The impact rippled through every corner of Richard's existence. At the textile mill, where he'd worked for decades, whispers followed him down every hallway. Co-workers who once respected him now looked at him with a mixture of pity and judgment. The man who had always prided himself on stability and control was now the subject of breakroom gossip. His wife left him. She's with someone younger. Can you imagine the humiliation? The family Richard had spent decades building split apart like a fault line. Michael and Jennifer, their two older children, sided with their mother without hesitation. They told Richard that maybe after 36 years, Sarah deserved happiness, deserved something different. Hearing his own children choose Sarah's narrative over his loyalty was a betrayal that cut deeper than the divorce papers themselves. Only David, their youngest son, stood by his father. He promised Richard he wouldn't abandon him. That blood meant something more than convenience. But even David's loyalty couldn't fill the void left by a family torn in half. Then came the blow that shattered what remained of Richard's dignity. Just 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, Sarah posted wedding photos online. She had married Marcus Rivera in an intimate ceremony, her face glowing with the kind of joy Richard hadn't seen from her in years. The images showed Sarah in a flowing white dress, Marcus beaming beside her in a perfectly tailored suit, both of them looking like they discovered the secret to eternal happiness. For Richard, those photos weren't just an announcement. They were a declaration of war. Sarah hadn't just moved on. She had moved on immediately, as if their 36 years together had been nothing more than an inconvenient delay before her real life could begin. The timeline was devastating. The affair that had been hidden behind gym sessions and late-night texts was now proudly displayed for the world to see. Richard sat in his empty house, scrolling through photo after photo, each image burning itself into his memory. Sarah's smile, Marcus's confident grin, the way they looked at each other with unguarded affection. This wasn't just replacement. This was complete erasure of everything Richard thought he'd built. That night, something fundamental shifted inside Richard Thornton. The man who had always believed in doing things the right way began planning something very wrong indeed. Chapter 4. The Humiliation That Festered. The months following Sarah's remarriage transformed Richard Thornton into someone even he didn't recognize. The man who had once been predictable, steady, and controlled was now consumed by an obsession that grew darker with each passing day. Sleep became elusive, replaced by hours spent scrolling through social media, torturing himself with images of Sarah and Marcus living the life that should have been his. Richard's daily routine became a ritual of self-inflicted pain. He would wake up, check Sarah's Facebook page, study every photo she posted with Marcus, and analyze every comment from friends congratulating them on their happiness. Each post felt like salt poured into an open wound, but he couldn't stop himself from looking. The addiction to his own suffering had become stronger than his desire to heal. His drinking, once limited to an occasional beer after work, escalated into nightly sessions with a bottle of whiskey. Richard would sit in his truck in empty parking lots, the engine running, the radio silent, nursing his anger with each sip. Neighbors began noticing his absence from weekend yard work, his withdrawal from church, and the way he avoided eye contact when they waved from across the street. At the textile mill, his supervisor pulled him aside twice about his declining performance. Richard, who had never missed a day in 36 years, was now calling in sick regularly, showing up late, and making mistakes that could have been dangerous. His co-workers, who once respected his dedication, began whispering about his obvious decline. The humiliation was complete. Not only had Sarah destroyed his home life, but her actions were now dismantling his professional reputation. The breaking point came in late August when Sarah posted a video of her and Marcus dancing in their kitchen, the same kitchen where Richard had shared thousands of meals with his family. Marcus's hands were wrapped around Sarah's waist, spinning her around as she laughed with pure joy. The song playing in the background was the same one that had played at Richard and Sarah's wedding 35 years earlier. That night, Richard made a decision that changed everything. Instead of wallowing in self-pity, he began planning. The obsessive energy that had been consuming him suddenly found focus and direction. He started making lists, studying schedules, and thinking through scenarios with the same methodical approach he had once applied to managing mill operations. Richard began making purchases that seemed innocent enough individually, but painted a darker picture when combined. Rope from the hardware store, tarps from the automotive section, cleaning supplies in bulk. He paid cash for everything, shopping at different stores, spreading the purchases across several weeks to avoid creating patterns. His surveillance of Sarah became systematic rather than emotional. He learned her work schedule, her gym routine, and her favorite restaurants. He discovered that Marcus worked late on Fridays, leaving Sarah alone for her evening commute. Information that had once fed his obsession now served a much more sinister purpose. Richard Thornton was no longer just a broken man drowning in whiskey and self-pity. He had become something far more dangerous, a predator with a plan. Chapter 5. The Night Everything Went Dark. September 15th, 2023, started like any other Friday for Sarah Thornton. She had no way of knowing that her ex-husband had been watching her office building for weeks, studying her patterns, memorizing her routine. She couldn't have imagined that the man she'd shared 36 years with had spent months planning this exact moment with the precision of a military operation. Richard parked his truck in the shadows of the parking garage, positioned where security cameras couldn't capture his license plate. In the passenger seat beside him sat two carefully chosen props, a manila envelope and a small bouquet of flowers. To anyone who might have glanced over, it would have looked like a gesture of reconciliation, an ex-husband trying to make amends. But Richard knew these weren't peace offerings. They were bait. The weight felt eternal, but Richard's hands remained steady. This wasn't the impulsive act of a broken man anymore. This was the calculated execution of a plan he'd rehearsed in his mind countless times. When Sarah finally appeared, walking toward her car with her purse slung over her shoulder, Richard stepped out of his vehicle and moved toward her with practiced calm. The security footage would later show those final moments of Sarah's normal life. Richard approached with flowers in one hand, the envelope in the other. Sarah stopped, her body language showing surprise and hesitation. You can almost see the calculation in her posture. Should she keep walking or stop to hear what he had to say? Richard spoke to her, his words too distant for the cameras to capture. But whatever he said made her pause. Maybe he told her it was about finalizing some forgotten paperwork. Maybe he mentioned something about their children. Whatever script he used, it worked. Sarah didn't run. She didn't call for help. Instead, she walked toward his truck, trusting the man she'd once promised to love forever. That trust sealed her fate. The moment Sarah was close enough, Richard revealed the knife he'd been concealing and forced her into his vehicle. In that instant, months of planning and surveillance culminated in complete control. The parking garage that had witnessed thousands of ordinary departures now held the last place Sarah Thornton would ever be seen alive. The drive out of town stretched through 20 miles of dark highway. Richard had chosen his destination months earlier, an abandoned quarry outside the city limits, the kind of forgotten place where screams would echo into emptiness and no one would think to look. Sarah must have known then that this wasn't about paperwork or final conversations. The reality of her situation would have settled in during that silent drive, trapped beside a man whose 36 years of love had transformed into something unrecognizable. When Richard finally stopped the truck and ordered Sarah out, the isolation was complete. No witnesses, no security cameras, no possibility of rescue. There, in that desolate place where industrial equipment had once carved stone from the earth, Richard turned months of humiliation into irreversible violence. The crime itself was swift but brutal. Investigators would later determine that Sarah's death wasn't just about ending her life. It was about punishing her for the choices she'd made, for the humiliation she'd caused, for the 36 years she'd apparently wasted on a man she could discard so easily. By midnight, Richard Thornton had become a killer, and Sarah's story had ended in the darkness of a place that would become her temporary grave. Chapter 6: The Perfect Illusion. After disposing of Sarah's body in the abandoned quarry, Richard Thornton didn't panic. Instead, he moved with the same methodical precision that had defined his 36 years at the textile mill. This wasn't the frantic cover-up of a man who had lost control. This was the calculated execution of a plan he'd been perfecting for months. The first step was Sarah's car. Richard drove it to the busy Walmart parking lot on the other side of town, positioning it among dozens of other vehicles where it would blend into the everyday chaos of weekend shopping. He wiped down every surface he'd touched, then added subtle touches that would support his narrative. Sarah's coffee cup half empty in the cup holder, her reusable shopping bags folded neatly in the back seat. To anyone who discovered the car, it would look like Sarah had simply stepped inside to run errands and would be back momentarily. But Richard's real genius lay in the digital deception he'd been preparing for months. During their marriage, Sarah had been predictably careless with technology, using the same passwords for everything. Combinations of their anniversary date, their children's birthdays, even their old dog's name. Richard had memorized them all, and Sarah had never thought to change them after the divorce. Why would she? In her mind, Richard was out of her life forever. From his laptop at home, Richard began orchestrating Sarah's digital presence like a puppet master. He scheduled Facebook posts using photos from her camera roll, casual updates about needing some space and time to think. He responded to concerned text messages from friends with short, vague replies that sounded exactly like Sarah when she was stressed. The responses were perfectly crafted, distant enough to explain her absence, but not alarming enough to trigger immediate concern. Richard's manipulation of Sarah's credit cards was equally strategic. He made small purchases at gas stations and convenience stores across 3 different counties, creating a trail that suggested Sarah was traveling, staying in budget motels, buying necessities while sorting through her emotions. He wore hoodies and baseball caps, keeping his face hidden from security cameras while creating just enough of a digital footprint to maintain the illusion. The plan worked flawlessly for weeks. Even Marcus, who should have been the most concerned about Sarah's disappearance, was fooled by the social media activity and occasional text messages. When he tried calling, Richard would let the calls go to voicemail, then send brief texts explaining that Sarah needed space to figure things out, that the quick marriage had been a mistake, that she needed time alone. Police, when they were finally contacted, treated it as a standard missing person case. A woman going through major life changes, taking some time for herself. It happened every day. The evidence supported a voluntary disappearance. Active social media, recent credit card usage, and a car parked as if she'd just stepped away temporarily. Richard sat in his empty house each evening, monitoring Sarah's accounts, crafting her digital presence, and feeling increasingly confident that he had committed the perfect crime. He had controlled every aspect of the narrative, and everyone was believing exactly what he wanted them to believe. For the first time in months, Richard Thornton felt powerful again. Chapter 7. When Arrogance Meets Justice. Richard's perfect illusion began cracking in February 2024. Digital forensic specialists, finally brought in after persistent pressure from Marcus and Sarah's daughter, Jennifer, discovered something Richard never anticipated. Every social media post, every text message, every online activity traced back to the same IP address. Not Sarah's phone, but Richard's home computer. The revelation was devastating. For months, investigators had been chasing a ghost, following digital breadcrumbs that led nowhere because the person they were tracking was already dead. Richard had been so confident in his technological manipulation that he'd left a clear trail pointing directly back to himself. The second crack came from nature itself. Heavy winter rains in March 2024 caused flooding throughout the region, washing away topsoil and exposing what Richard had buried 6 months earlier. A jogger discovered fabric protruding from the muddy ground near the quarry, and within hours, crime scene investigators were carefully excavating Sarah's remains. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The rope used to bind her wrists matched rolls found in Richard's garage. Soil samples from his truck tires contained minerals specific to the quarry location. Most damning of all, Richard's cell phone data placed him at the exact spot where Sarah's body was found on the night she disappeared. When police arrived at Richard's house on March 18, 2024, they found him sitting calmly at his kitchen table, staring at an old wedding photo. He looked up at the arresting officers with steady eyes and said 5 words that chilled everyone present. "I was wondering when you'd come." The trial lasted 3 weeks. His own children testified against him, describing a man consumed by hatred and obsession. On November 15, 2024, Richard Thornton was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no emotion as the verdict was read, just as he had shown no remorse during his confession. Richard had traded 36 years of marriage for 36 years behind bars, his own twisted version of forever. What do you think drove Richard to murder? Drop your thoughts below, smash that like button, and subscribe for more twisted tales of love turned deadly. Tomorrow, we're going to be diving into more cases you won't want to miss. Until next time, stay safe.